Okay, we're gonna start up. I know we want to be as punctual as possible. My name is Ace. I'll be the moderator for this amazing group of women who are going to talk about today for the listening session, volume 2, racial trauma and Black mental health. First of all, I just want to go over a couple things. For those who are attending, you will notice that there's only so many screens that you can visually see. So attendees will not be able to see other attendees' screens. You will see the speakers themselves and other individuals who have spoken, individuals of Indigenous background, people of color, or individuals who identify as Black. Now, one big thing for individuals who are asking about Q&A, I know last listening session, some people weren't sure about that, and the last 30 minutes of this segment will be given to the speakers to answer any questions or comments. I know there's a lot of information they're going to go into. I wanted to reflect on the sponsors. We have People's United of Ellington, CD Builders, Ellington Dental, and Trattoria de la Prix. We want to thank them for their sponsorship, as well as any individuals who may pop up on the screen. If you do not identify in the people of color community, Black community, or Indigenous community, please turn off your cameras. These listening sessions, again, are if you are not part of those communities, to be a listening session, to make sure that you are taking in as much information as possible and be able to process that. And have the weekend to process it even more, because you really should sit in with that information, and the amount of information. I'm excited for this listening session, and I'm going to turn it over. So for our wonderful speakers, whomever would like to start.
Well, hello and happy Friday. Thank you so much for that great introduction. Now I feel like we have a lot to live up to, so thank you. But we are so excited to be with you all, and just so grateful for this space. And I will borrow something that Dr. Crumb often says, is that we used to use the word safe space a lot, right? But we think about having brave spaces. And so it is our hope and desire that we will have 90 minutes of brave space tonight. And so my name is Janee Harris, and I am going to get us started, and we'll introduce ourselves, and then we'll kind of go into the content for the evening. And I'll also kind of provide some context of how we hope that this will be a dialogue, not just a monologue. And so I'll get into that in a little bit as well. So welcome to Racial Trauma and Black Mental Health, a listening session. Our vision for the next hour and a half is to have an open dialogue, is to have a brave space about current events, the impact of those events, and mental health. I think what's so, I guess the word unfortunate is coming to mind for me, and telling is that we do these seminars or type seminars frequently. And every time we do another seminar, there's another headline, there's another life that has been taken from us tragically, and there's another kind of conversation that's happening about race. And so we really hope to make some change. So like I said, my name is Janee Harris. I am an assistant professor and the program coordinator for the counselor education program at East Carolina University. I'm a counselor. I did a lot of my work in college counseling settings. And I do research in the intersections of faith and mental health, particularly for African American communities, and what the role of the Black church looks like in that. And so I am going to toss it to Dr. Hammonds, who is going to be next and introduce herself a little bit.
Thank you, Dr. Avent Harris. I'll just, I want to pick on you for just a moment, because you neglected to say that you are no longer, or very soon to be no longer, an assistant professor. You've recently been promoted to associate professor, so I want to give you—
True, thank you.
Congratulations. So my name is Dominique Hammonds, and I am in a similar boat as Dr. Avent Harris. I have also just recently been promoted to associate professor and received tenure at my university, at Appalachian State University. My research focuses on multicultural issues in counseling, counselor education, and supervision. I split my time between working at the university, teaching, consulting, and seeing clients out in the field. So as a consultant, I do what's called JEDI consulting, right? Justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And I think we're all here because we understand the importance of that work. So I'm excited to be with you all tonight to talk about these issues and to hear from you. The exciting thing about a listening session is we get to just kind of weigh in, but also hear what's happening in your specific community. And then we can offer our feedback, and hopefully you'll be able to take some information that you hear today and use within your sphere of influence. So again, I am excited to get into these issues today.
All right, thank you, Dr. Hammonds. I am Dr.Loni Crumb. I'm a assistant professor at East Carolina University. I am also a licensed clinical mental health counselor supervisor, in which I provide supervision for our students who are training on their journey to becoming professional counselors. My research and service areas are around helping those who traditionally face a lot of health disparities. So I work with trying to find equity in mental health services, and education for underserved populations, as well as working in underserved areas such as rural and remote, rural areas and remote areas that the services are there, which they really will have a lot of shortages in educational resources and mental health services. I also oversee for our program the school-based counseling, and making sure that our school counselors are trained to work with children, and our clinicians who enter the schools are entering schools to do justice and to promote growth in our youth, and making sure that these issues of trauma and social unrest, kids aren't blind to these issues. So making sure that they are actively broaching these, because students are very curious, and we do not need to keep them out of these conversations either.
Thank you, Dr. Crumb. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Angie Cartwright, and I'm an associate professor at the University of North Texas. Of our group, I'm the only one that's not situated in North Carolina. So I am in Texas. So most of my work is centered on underserved populations. Those underserved populations range from offender populations to Black and Brown folks in counseling and counselor education. Most of my time is spent at the University of North Texas teaching and coordinating our undergraduate program. But this year, my role has taken quite a bit of a shift, and it's relevant to what we're discussing tonight. And so I co-founded and created what we call the Anti-Bias and Cultural Awareness Program at the University of North Texas. And it is a mandatory training requirement for all academic affairs faculty and staff. So this past year, we've trained over 2,500 people. And so that's been really exciting work. In my private practice, I mainly see clients who present with sexual behavior problems. Most of you might know them as sexual offenders. So that provides quite a range of counseling services. I think for me, one of my most important roles is being a mom. And so it's really hard to separate out, your professional and your personal roles. So all the work that all of us do is really intersected in multiple identities, being Black, being women, and everything that occurs in our personal and professional lives. So very excited to be with you all this evening, and thank you for having us.
And I want to jump back. I actually asked the group, our group is collectively known as the Four Doctors, and I specifically made the request for us to share a little bit about our personal lives, because healing comes from not moving past the borders of your professional being and into your personal being, right? And so thank you, Dr. Cartwright, for remembering that. And I really wanted to share with everybody with us today how important my role of having 2 Black sons is to my advocacy work, and how significant having a Black husband is when in times of social unrest. Like, I'm surrounded by Black males, so I can't be absent. I cannot be silent on these issues. I have to educate and I have to act. And how that intersects with the other parents out there, and how you feel about your sons, and wanting to protect them, whether you're brown, Black, purple, white, blue, it does not matter. We can all relate and have empathy for each other through our intersections.
Dr. Hammonds, did you want to share a little bit, and then I'll kind of
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Dr. Crumb, for remembering that, and Dr. Cartwright. I also have two sons, a 2-year-old and an almost 7-year-old. So similarly, I cannot do this work without also pulling in my personal experiences. And in my classes, I tell stories about my family and things that have happened, and even things that involve my own just kind of experiences walking through the world, and how I intentionally navigate having conversations with my sons. We might even share some of those stories tonight, but I completely agree. We are whole people, we are human beings, and we have intersecting identities, and all of those things are relevant to how we navigate issues of race, gender, equity, you know, all of our intersecting identities. So, thanks.
Yeah. And so, yes, I too am a mom, and I have a 5-year-old daughter, which has also been interesting because I have the only girl in the group. And so some of the things that she is confronted with, and we may talk about this a little later as far as it relates to racism and discrimination, have been very interesting, right? To compare our stories. And then I have a 6-month-old son. And so that's also, I was thinking the other day, I was in the mall, and someone was like, oh, he's so cute. And I was reminded of that meme that says, like, at what point does my child stop being cute and start being a threat? And so I've been constantly just thinking about that as people are like, he's so cute, he's so cute. So yeah, we come as full people. We come vulnerable, we come bringing those intersecting identities in, and we don't mind sharing about that too. So we're kind of open and transparent in that way. Also, I would like to note that I spend a lot of time with these ladies, but every time I hear them introduce themselves, I'm like, oh my God, they are so awesome. They are so amazing. So I'm always struck by that. So we'll start with a little context, a little background as we talk about mental health in Black communities. As I talked about earlier, that's one of my research areas. And so I'll kind of start with what we know and then think back to, okay, beyond the numbers, why might some of these disparities exist? So what we know that African Americans are among the least likely populations to go seek help as it relates to mental health. Probably more so, Black men in particular have some of the lowest help seeking rates of any population. We know that, right? We also know that many scholars have said that African Americans are more at risk for psychological stressors. They are more susceptible to things like anxiety and depression, right? So we have those numbers. Those numbers are pretty stark. We see them a lot. And so the question that I have been moving to, because doing this research, when I write papers, I have to always check myself because I feel like I start from a very deficit perspective. I'm like, African Americans are least likely to go seek help. As I've moved through this work, as I've grown, as I've matured, I started thinking about why might these things be, right? And so we have to deal with some of those. Mental health is a largely predominantly white profession, even more so as you move up into counselor educators. So as you move up into the professors who's training the counselor, it becomes more white and more male. Also, there's not been a trust between Black communities and medical professionals, right? Because there have been some things that have been done wrong. We heard recently about Tuskegee experiment as it relates to the hesitancies about the vaccine. I'm often reminded there was a particular psychiatric hospital that was designed for Black people that was in Virginia. And if you go back and read some of the records, people were put in this hospital for having miscarriages, for divorce. And so it's very interesting to see how mental health was shaped and what narrative was presented in Black communities. So I think it's important to have that context. And then there's just layers of trauma. So unemployment. In the wake of COVID, African Americans were disproportionately affected both in the numbers of infection, but also in loss. And so there's this grief and loss that's kind of lingering over communities, almost like a cloud. We all probably can say we know someone who died of COVID, or even beyond physical death, what dreams were impacted, what businesses were lost, how was education, right? There's been a spotlight on education. We knew there were disparities in education. COVID just shone a light on that. And so how Black and brown communities were even impacted in that. So we think about the layers of trauma. And yet, part of the research that I do is about the Black church. And so I always have to speak to, and yet there is this resilience, right? There's this persistence. And so I want to honor that as we think about trauma. I want to honor, that's why I don't like the word grit, because I feel like that's a whole other subject. But when you think about teaching grit or measuring grit, I'm like, there are whole communities who have had to survive some really tough things, and they do. And so I honor that persistence as well. So we hope that, and through our advocacy, through us being counselor educators, that we diversify our field, our profession, that we are able to dispel myths, that we are able to destigmatize, and that we are able to create more access for more communities. And if you think about a common thread in our work, was reaching out to communities that have been historically marginalized and underserved. And so we hope to increase some of those help-seeking numbers, but we just don't want to send people to counselors. We want to send people to counselors who are prepared, who are culturally responsive, who are affirming, and who have knowledge and awareness of diverse cultures. So I'll stop there because we can get bogged down in that. So I want to be mindful of time. So I'll toss it to Dr. Cartwright to kind of set up some ideas about how we can interact through this session.
Yes. So one of the things that I genuinely love and appreciate about this group of amazing women is that we are very collaborative and very relational in nature. And so one of the best ways to combat some of the things that we're talking about today is to develop relationships with people. Oftentimes, people shift and change their values and beliefs based on the people who they know, the people's experiences that they learn about and that they share. And so for us to have a bit of context about who you are and what's going on with you all, we would really, really like to know what brought you here today and what are you hoping to get from our time together. And so I'm really aware that we are in Zoom webinar. So we have folks who are logged in, who are participating via the Q&A and the chat. I think you all should be able to engage in the chat and just share, some of the things that you hope to gain from our time together, and then, what brought you here today. And so I'll be more than happy to read off some of the things that occur in the chat. And we're hoping that we can meet your expectations tonight.
Well, I'll speak. I think, as a proud Black man, and this year and a half has been very traumatic overall. And even though things are letting up, I think you've seen a lot of still the remnants of COVID and the lockdown and everything else. I just think that, the mental anguish, how to deal with it sometimes. When I was at North Star, I was in an outpatient program where I was seeing someone one-on-one, just to kind of talk, because, even if you're in business development back then, you have a lot of pressure on yourself. So something you need.
It looks like we might have lost his audio, but I know that we'll continue with the other individuals in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but I was able to capture some of what he said in his positionality as a Black man. Correct. Mm-hmm. Yes, and the impact that everything has had on him and his being. I did catch that. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Okay, well.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, anyways, the point is that it feels and a lot more men, white, Black, otherwise we're going to see therapists, because It was like once a week. It was nothing, any major outstanding issue to worry about. It's just someplace to vet sometimes. Sometimes I think, in particular, Black men, or when you're the only Black man in the office, a lot of times they think you're Superman, and you have to be perfect. And you don't have a lot of outlets. You wake up.
So it sounds like we may have lost Mark again, but just to summarize, some of what I think he was saying is that there's this immense amount of pressure to be perfect. And it's not something that anyone can understand unless they're walking in those shoes. So even as, a Black woman, I will never understand what life is like for Mark. And so Mark, I just want to say, you are the only Black man that I am able to see right now on this call. So I thank you for sharing your experience, for being transparent, and for being vulnerable and sharing, about your own mental health and about your journey with your colleagues and coworkers at work, and just how, it sounds like this year has just really been really traumatic and stressful and just probably downright exhausting for you. So thank you so much for trusting us to share that.
So, hi, everyone. So my name is Giselle Janee, and so I am an administrator. I'm an assistant principal in a school as well, many educators here. And so I work in a community of a very high needs population, lots of Latinos, people of color in general, African Americans, Afro-Americans. We see ourselves, we identify ourselves in so many ways. As in many schools, and I'm quite sure that you are familiar with this, the majority of educators tend to be people who identify as white. And many of those are in our audience, perhaps, as well as people who maybe don't have much connection, positive connection with people of color, or those who work with people of color, but they just don't seem to understand this whole trauma thing. Like, if you really think about the George Floyd incident was one thing, but many people just don't feel like there is such a thing as racial trauma. So if you wonderful women, if you can help people really understand what really is racial trauma, and what can they take back with them and help them to maybe do their jobs better, probably just to have a little bit more empathy. What can you give them to help them better deal with young boys and girls who are experiencing trauma, so trauma itself, and then racial trauma? Because we do want people to move away from this feeling a bit more equipped to deal with issues involving people of color and their jobs and social lives and so forth.
Thank you so much, Giselle. So it sounds like you're one of the main things that you like from our time together this evening is some action, so what can be done. So yes, some understanding, and also what to do with that understanding. So we can certainly cover some of that. Just to move back to the chat just a little, I'd like to just read some of the things that have come into the chat about, why you're here and things that you're hoping to take away. Someone says that they're here to increase their cultural awareness, an invitation from a friend, a chance to learn. And then someone says, let's see here, I'm going to enlarge my chat so I can see it. I'm always looking to understand racial justice through a new lens and from new perspectives. As an activist, I recognize that there's so much I don't know or understand, that I need to seek new information at every opportunity. Thank you. Then the next one is came to this space for exposure. Grew up in a predominantly white community. I'd like to learn and grow and understand and advocate. So thank you for that. And then someone says, I'm lucky to know Sonia, who has brought this panel to my attention. I hope to gain more understanding of my privilege as a white cis woman to learn what I can do to uplift BIPOC voices. So that's just a few of the things that have come into the chat. So thank you all for sharing, why you're here this evening and the things that you're hoping to take away. And I'm very hopeful and confident that we'll be able to assist with, of course, helping you to understand racial trauma, and then talking about advocacy and action as well.
I would love to ask a question.
Sure.
So my name is Sonia Taylor Smith. I'm an education consultant. I started Stafford Springs Diversity Coalition. I'm also a co-director of a new school. And one of the things that I would love to have you guys go into a little bit more depth is the generational trauma, the trauma that's being passed down. Because I feel as an African-American female that I'm dealing with my existence in this world and finding my footing. But I also find that I'm also experiencing and processing the trauma that was passed down to me in terms of my family members and their experience. And so for me, being a African-American female, I've always been hyper-focused on that. That's something that I've never been able to separate my existence as Sonia from being African-American, and how that plays in terms of the spaces that I'm in, the communications that I have, the things in which I do. And that story is not unique to me as being Sonia. It's unique to so many other people that are African-American and people of color. The trauma that their families have experienced has shaped the way in which they move in the world to address it.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Actually, you all have created a great segue. Dr. Crumb is going to talk a little bit more in depth about what is racial trauma, how do we recognize it, and then Dr. Crumb, if you could also speak to that part about generational trauma and how we often show up very aware of our own identities and what that means, but we also carry our grandma's experiences, and I carry my dad's experiences, so I very much resonate with you, Sonia. So I'll pass it to you, Dr. Crumb.
Okay, so much. I'm writing and I'm trying to like cap all of my feedback, and I know my colleagues will jump in, but I just want to start right now with just setting the base. I cannot assume that everybody knows the definition of trauma, what trauma entails. And I also believe that we can get lost because there are multiple definitions based upon your background and your discipline area. So I found one that I find that is pretty encompassing and leaves space to insert your personal perception. So understanding trauma. Trauma is damage or injury to the psyche after living through that's either experiencing or indirectly experiencing an extremely frightening or distressing event that may result in challenges in functioning and coping normally after the event. Okay. And then trauma can show up physically, psychologically, socially, emotionally, and behaviorally. All types of things. Think about how when someone has a traumatic event, some people may isolate. Some people may do something totally out of the norm. Some people may stop eating. Some people may overeat, right? And so what we learned yesterday, I was actually in the audience of a racial healing group yesterday, and the presenters talked about in-depthly the direct relationship between trauma and health, especially racial trauma and health, because what we know is a lot of high blood pressure, health issues, different things, migraine, headaches, just this heightened stress from what's going on or worrying about our children, the safety of our children or our parents or our spouses causes traumatic stress. One other thing that I would love to share with the audience, we've been counselors, it may not look like it because of our youth, but we've been counselors for quite a long time. And with the advancement of social media and the news picking up almost every single event, I have seen over the last years just this more vicarious impact of what we call vicarious trauma, seeing the actual videos of police killings or shootings and violence, seeing this happen, kids having it on their phones, the news media playing it, the top of the news hour, the middle of the news hour, and the end of the news hour. Just this overconsumption of seeing these people die. right there. And especially if you have something in common with them, if you are the same race, if you are a male, if you are an immigrant and you see people at the border struggling, right, and separated from their kids, there's a level of empathy, impact that immigrants have in North Carolina with what's going on at the bordering states that can be traumatizing to them. And so I just want everybody to understand that you do not have to directly experience the event to have a psychological adverse effect to or reaction to the trauma. There are many symptoms of trauma. One that, as Sonia was speaking, when she talks about generational trauma, another word that can really capture that is distrust. Distrust in people, distrust in symptoms, and that stuff runs deep. We're taking it back to the Tuskegee experiment, and we're talking about COVID, but you see how deep that distrust runs. The ability to distrust to not trust vaccines because of what has happened to people in the past, which is very valid, right? These people have a right to feel that way because this is nothing that we're making up. These are things that were done to our people. Okay, so first, do not discount and don't say that this was a long time ago. This actually occurred. And we usually come from a critical race perspective, I will say that, or critical perspective, saying that when things are in fact, we don't question it. So we will not go back and forth to say, well, racism doesn't exist, this doesn't exist. No, it does. And we will start all of our presentations with that understanding that we don't take time to question whether racism exists. We know that it does. And that's one thing that we know is true. So when you're talking about generational trauma, that's what I think about, the long-term, a curious journalist, the distrust that we've had in systems and in people, particularly since we're here and we're going to be very blunt, in white people with power, right? And who have misused that power. Not like being white makes you inherently bad. It's how people have historically misused that power to harm others is what is the issue. And I need that to be heard by everybody. It's not one thing that makes people inherently bad. It's the misuse of power that makes the inherently bad people and do inherently bad things to other people that last from generations to generations, right? But everybody has the ability to unlearn. Right? Everybody has the ability to unlearn this, right? And that goes both ways. That goes to the oppressed and the oppressor. Both of us have something to do. All of us have a duty when we're talking about racial trauma and racial healing. For the oppressed, some of us have been socially conditioned to hate certain groups. As soon as we were 2, 3, 4 years old, we knew who our parents may have told us who not to associate with. I mean, we have stories after stories after stories from having these conversations and doing these presentations with others, how people have been conditioned to hate other groups just because. So these people have not even had the opportunity to establish relationships of their own to learn about people. So someone talked about exposure, right? And systems are set up that way. Schools have been set up that way to keep kids from learning together, from showing that we're all human. And these systems are still in place right now. And a lot of times social class plays a difference and money plays a difference in this too. All right, and for the oppressed, the people of color, what we have to spend a lot of time on when we're talking about racial trauma and healing is unlearning internalized oppression. Question ourselves and our abilities and who we are because of that generational trauma and that history of being oppressed. And so those are some of my main points that I want to speak about when you brought up generational trauma. Now, going back to the signs and symptoms, because we are counselors of trauma, some things that are really common, nightmares, ruminating thoughts. I know myself and someone else on this call, we're so visual and so emotional that 2 of us out of the 4 will not watch any of the videos of the killings directly because I cannot take myself there. If I take myself there, I'm going to be stuck seeing this man die. Like I can read about it, I can hear about it, but if I see it, I'm going to be so broken, right? And so these visual images of the event, mood swings. When there was last year, I think it was Ahmaud Arbery, so many happens, a lot of people of color disconnected, checked out, and it was absolutely okay. But on isolation, to just wrap our head around hate and why it's happening. And then think about the people the African Americans or the indigenous people, the BIPOC people who didn't have the opportunity to disconnect, who had to show up at work with these people the next day, right? And how that felt for them. How does that feel? That had to be tough. When you starting to question normalcy, you start to question your white friends, you start to question people in your circle. Like, this is trauma. Why? And this is having to do that daily, right? Takes away from positive growth and development. All right. Avoidance of activities, choosing the colleges you want to go to, choosing the soccer team. So avoidance of activities, lack of interest, feeling hopeless, which we always want to move past hopeless. We're doing this discussion today to move towards hope, but people giving up that change will ever take place. We're never going to give up on that. But that is very true. People will feel like white people are always going to be racist. They're always going to be this. You know, this W.B. Du Bois said this hundreds and hundreds of years ago that this would be the case. But feeling helpless and hopeless. Of course, the being easily startled, behavioral problems in kids. I've seen this so many times over the years that some of our Black and brown kids start distrusting teachers, and kids don't always have the wealth of language that adults do. So they'll start to misbehave or disconnect. But really, they're trying to express that I see something on TV going on between white people and Black people, and I don't like it. So I'm gonna treat the white teacher real mean, right? And the white teacher's like, oh my God, but I didn't do it, type of thing. But kids are only communicating how they know, and usually that's through their behavior. And so that's how to pick up on trauma or vicarious trauma taking place within children. Irritability, anxiety, panic attacks. And going back to irritability, the angry Black woman phenomena. Oh man, like, can we just tonight just put that to sleep? Because if I'm thinking correctly, shouldn't everybody be angry over violence, hate, and killing? Is that anything to be really excited about? Right? And so when you hear that, I just want everybody in the audience to just question, isn't that very logical, right? For a person to be angry because people are getting killed. Children are getting killed by police for being innocent, shot from the back. You know, and that should make everybody a bit upset. Okay, all right.
And Dr. Crumb, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Were you finished? Two things came to mind. Part of Sonia's point and part of Giselle's point. You know, imagine if we as educators, right, would reconstruct how the narrative, and instead of saying this student is bad, this student is acting out, what if we change the narrative to this student is responding to trauma, and how that might change our approach to that student, how that student will have more access to resources, how it could change the trajectory from being diagnosed with a behavior disorder versus what it would look like to be diagnosed with trauma. Or PTSD. And so I would just encourage, one of the things Giselle says, what can educators do to reimagine, even in your mind, when a student is irritable in your class, when a student is acting out, how might this be trauma showing up in my class, and what can I do about it? And then to Sonia's point, before, when you were talking about generational trauma, I have a quick story, because like we did say we would share. So when I was growing up, our neighbors had a pool, and it was two white girls, and they were the same age as my little brother. And so one day, my dad got home, and my brother was at our neighbor's house, and he was in the pool with the white girls, and my dad like does this image of him. He was just on there backstroking. And my dad said, "Get out of that pool." And so my brother could not understand. So my daddy called me. He was like, "You need to tell your brother to get out, da da da." But it was because back in my dad's day, if someone had pulled up and saw him in a pool with two white girls, like that could have very well ended really, really bad. And so I thought about that, Sonia, when you talked about that generational trauma. My dad was kind of responding based on that. So I think Dr. Hammonds is going to pick up next, if I'm not mistaken, and kind of talk about, and I think this is a good transition because we talk about what is, and to Dr. Crumb's point, while it feels heavy right now, I am doing everything I can to sit in the heaviness, but not move to hopelessness. And so part of it is acknowledging what is, and then how do we begin healing? How do we begin to move into a different space? And so I love what Giselle said too about like, how do we reimagine even our schools? How do we reimagine our spheres of influence, our churches? How do we reimagine our community centers so that we can move towards this racial healing? So I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Hammonds.
Before we move on, I have one quick thing that I'd like to say, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
So I know that we're talking about racial trauma and mental health, but I think it's really important to also highlight the physical health things as well. So, you know, when I think about this and I think about like physical health, one of the things that comes to mind for me is Black maternal health. We know right now with Black women who are experiencing pregnancy that they have the highest mortality rates. It's skyrocketed through the roof. And so I think about generationally how that impacts children. What is that going to be like for those children to grow up without their mothers? What is that going to be like? You know, and then also thinking of pregnancy. You know, if you're pregnant right now, and I know that Dr. Avent Harris has been, you know, she has a 6-month-old. And so I think about, you know, a lot of, you know, how we feel during our pregnancy, the things that occur in society while we're pregnant. Our children experience those things, you know, in the womb. And so I think it's important to also think about generational trauma and maternal health as we talk about mental health. Those physical things are so very important too. So I just wanted to highlight that. And then Dr. Crumb mentioned about disparities in schools. And so one of the tangential things that we know as fact is redlining is real. And so redlining, so that's one of the things, you know, Dr. Crumb said, you know, we're not going to argue about these things, but I also feel like sometimes people want to argue about these things. And so redlining is a fact. It still happens. And so when redlining occurs, we know that those schools that are associated with higher SES communities get the textbooks, they get the tablets, they get the resources, you know. So during this time of COVID, a lot of children were impacted because perhaps they couldn't afford Wi-Fi. Maybe Wi-Fi was not available at homes. Maybe there were no tablets. You know, there are so many resource type things that that occur through policies. And so we'll talk a little bit more about advocacy later, but those are just a couple of things that I wrote down that I really wanted to make sure to put in there.
As I was listening to all of you speak, a phrase that we talk about in counseling just kept coming up for me. And I think all of us, all the counselors in the room probably have heard this before, but it's all behavior makes sense in context. And as I think about racial trauma, as I think about people's reaction to traumatic events that they may have experienced directly or indirectly, we have to begin to normalize the traumatic response that then comes from that. Right? Instead of stigmatizing it and then labeling it as a personal problem. Oh, so-and-so is bad. They are not coping in the way that they should be coping. Or they're struggling mentally because perhaps they're, whatever it is, there's a negative connotation when we forget to consider full context of what's happening, right? So then if we take the time to do that, hopefully what we then begin to usher in is compassion and empathy, a cultural responsiveness, and also a nod to the structural components, the system that actually made it possible for these things to happen. and not only happen, I would say to keep happening, right? That's how we are stuck in this generational cycle where we're then now passing down our completely contextually and behaviorally appropriate responses to these events to our children and our children's children, right? In the example that Dr. Avent Harris gave, her father was reacting to an event that made sense, right? But I can imagine maybe for someone else looking from the outside in, that response may have been overblown. They may have seen it as not disproportionate to what the experience was. But then when you begin to consider context, right? Identity, experiences, but also you have to consider the system in which we have been steeped in. Outside of all those things, probably wouldn't make sense, but now we get it. And then what happens to your brother who's sitting there like, well, what? I'm just having fun with the neighbors and I don't understand. But now he's left trying to understand and make sense of that experience. There's so much that comes with that. And I can only imagine what that must have been like for him, trying to conceptualize that, making sense of it, rattling that around in his brain, and then perhaps moving forward, now beginning to question how he interacts with those neighbors. That's what we mean by generational trauma. That response that her father had was contextually appropriate. And so this is where coping comes in too, and why it's so important. So these are coping responses that then we're trying to create a facilitative reaction or response for us, right? We're protecting ourselves, protecting our children, protecting those that we care about, protecting maybe those that we are responsible for in our professional roles. And without the consideration of the whole context, none of it makes sense. But this is what this work is about. The encouragement of us all together to begin to look at restorative justice and begin to understand all of the systems, all of the behaviors, all of our experiences in context. If we fall into the trap of looking singularly at someone's actions or behaviors without that thing, then we miss the whole. We are in trouble in doing that. And I'll be quite honest, I think that too often that's what we as a whole in this country have done. Right? And that's what restorative justice is about. It's about accountability and beginning to repair harm that's been done, systemic harm. So and I think that the difficulty here is there's no wrong or right way to do this, I would say. I think that there are steps that typically restorative justice involves, but it can also represent empty action if you just follow the steps, right? And I think we've all been on the receiving end of someone, perhaps, I'm just going to use this metaphor because I think it relates, but perhaps apologizing, but then you really knowing it's an empty apology. Yeah. So how do we create an environment? How do we create a system in which restorative justice can begin to happen, but meaningfully, not without empty promises, empty gestures, things that people just say to check off a list to say, okay, I've done it. Are you happy now? I don't think that's what anybody wants. We don't want the "are you happy now?" We want the meaningful action. So then that's what I hope that we can begin to talk about is, given some of the challenges within your own environments, perhaps where you work or your individual community, what would restorative justice look like? And how might that begin to occur?
Dr. Hammonds, do you mind if I follow up really quickly? Do you, I hate to put you on the spot, but can you think of an example of a time when you have seen restorative justice like happen maybe in your community so that people can have a kind of some context for that, of what that looks like?
Sure. Well, I can say 3 general steps of restorative justice involves community building, intervention, and investment. So community building would be beginning to create and develop spaces for the people who have been harmed in a specific situation to begin to rebuild, right? To develop some type of relationships among one another so that there is, again, that sense of community. When you begin to chip away at the community, you begin to chip away at growth and health and wholeness and wellness. And it's important to start there first, right? To begin to have the difficult conversations. And to do that openly, honestly, and dare I say, how do I put this? Without ego. Often people say, I'm here to listen, but really their ego is sitting right here. And then that ego tends to block them from actually hearing, because we all know that hearing is different than listening, right? I'm looking around the room, I'm seeing the shaking of the heads. We all know that hearing is different from listening. And it's often that our ego that gets in the way, that stops us from doing that. Because in really hearing what someone says, especially if the people have been wronged, if the people say, here is how I have been wrong, and here is how you personally are culpable, whether directly or indirectly, that is hard to hear.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Hammonds, if I might just also add to what you're saying about restorative justice. So in our school district, in many of our schools, we do practice, and it can be a bit complicated, but and I know we do have some law enforcement personnel in our audience, and so I really do want to speak to restorative justice and what this really looks like and what it might sound like. So it might sound like we do know that in education we have we hear about kids of color in kindergarten who are being expelled. Now, there's a difference also between suspension and expulsion, because the suspension is anything under 10 days and expulsion is anything from that's 10 days or more. So we hear about little brown boys and girls being expelled from schools for sometimes things that they don't even quite understand themselves. So restorative justice could be where you have a circle and you have a certain number of individuals, and you have the person who has committed the act, and you have the person to whom the act was committed. And so restorative justice, and I say, I really want to think about this on a larger scale of the criminal justice system. And so really this might look like having a conversation, getting to the bottom of what happened, why did it happen, how can we ensure, what actions can we implement to make sure that this doesn't happen. Really having a conversation the way you might have a conversation with a child about why they may not want to touch something hot. And for a lot of people coming from homes where they've had to deal with trauma, where they've had to deal with generational trauma, where they've had to deal with racial trauma, it's amazing what can result from having a conversation. So not to be too quick to act. I think about that woman who supposedly pulled out she thought it was a taser. I don't know how that could have happened. And she shot this black boy, this black man, young man, and killed him. Really? So what was it that made her so quickly grab her really gun, right? Because, and we can go into, the difference between a taser and a gun, but really, she didn't give him an opportunity to really explain or give him the opportunity of a human being, right? To just say, well, you know what could it be? What is it that's going on in this young man's life that might make him want to challenge authority, for example? So restorative justice means allowing people of color the opportunity to speak, as we do with many white children, as we do with white adults, and moving away from racism toward that, that racial healing.
Giselle, I often think about it. I've worked as a college counselor at predominantly white institutions primarily, and I cannot tell you the number of my clients who have been white who have been able to tell me stories about things that happened in high school. So I remember that time I was stealing from this. I remember that time I was caught with drugs. And where I've been sitting with lately is that I wish more of our Black and brown kids had the opportunity to say, I remember when, right? To move through, to be given the opportunity to move past that quote unquote mistake. And so I think about the number of my white clients who have lived to see another day, and now they're in college and they're able to get jobs and they're able to move through because that they weren't held to that moment, and that they weren't, I mean, very bluntly killed in that moment, right? And so when you said that, that just really struck me, because I've sat with that for the last couple of weeks probably.
And I want to follow up with a very real and practical experience. There's something big in North Carolina going on about a police killing a man from the back. And I was maybe last year, year before, I had a group of kids, elementary level, and we were just trying to create positive relationships with law enforcement and their perception of law enforcement. And every single Black boy in that group had not had a personal interaction with any law enforcement officer of any kind, but their parents, grandparents, brothers, uncles had different types of interactions, and not all positive interactions with law enforcement. So I asked them a question. So what would you do if they showed up? Guess what the little boy said? Run. 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 Run was the first response out of all of the little boys in the group. And that hurt me, because I'm taken aback right now when I have to say that. It says on the side of their car to protect and to serve.
Right.
To protect and to serve. But these little boys, I'm talking about.
Can I say something?
7, 8, 9. Yes, go ahead.
Oh, well, what you're seeing right now in this country, right, is that, and globally, is that people are realizing that this has been going on for a long time, and incident after incident, it's continuing to happen, right? But the flip side of that coin is the people I know, especially the younger Black people I know, aren't putting up with it anymore, right? And no disrespect to John Lewis or Elijah Cummings and that generation, but what you're seeing right now is that these kids, and a lot of white kids too, are joining. They're not putting up with that anymore. They are standing up, okay? And that's why most of these protests after a murder of a Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin, there's a march for a month or two, and then everything calms down and goes back to normal. This year, when I say traumatic, this past year and a half, I'm talking about the lockdown, I'm talking about the deaths, I'm talking about the march. But what you're seeing right now is a lot of younger people and a lot of older people aren't putting up with it. So if you're going to shoot this person in the back, or we're going to go to your house, and I'm not calling for violence, I'm not saying that. But my point is, there is no, hey, I'm going to get my ass whooped on a bridge and saying we shall overcome, and that's going to be another story. People are starting to step up right now. You see it night after night. There will be repercussions if you do shoot someone unjustly in the back, right? Those days are over, and I don't think people realize it right now. I think some people still have this privilege that they think that things are going to go back to normal, and there is no turning back right now, right? So those young boys that you're talking about, they're not going to be, I show people respect that give me respect. My point to you is that the days of just saying, oh, well, Amadou Diallo, Yusuf Hawkins, Sean Bell, Breonna Taylor, all these people, that's not going to continue to happen without any repercussions right now. Do you agree with what I'm saying?
Yeah, I totally get it.
So those young Black boys, they're seeing that. Anyway, I just have to get it off my chest. Go ahead. Sorry.
I would love to piggyback off of that if I could.
I'm gonna just pause you, Sonia, for a second, just because we're having a great time, and I'm soaking it up like a sponge. But I know it's 7:30, and we were gonna start the Q&A soon, and I know Dr. Cartwright, I know you wanted. I see it like the movement there, and I didn't know if there was anything for the speakers they really wanted to get to before we start the even more conversation
We
in
do
other
have-
directions.
Thank you so much, Ace. We do have one more critical piece, and we will move through it very quickly, trying to be respectful of time and to also allow for, commentary and questions from those who are in attendance. But, one of the things that comes to mind for me is intent does not equal impact. You can be well-intentioned, and your impact can have lasting effects in horrible, horrible ways. So just know that although the intention, you may have wonderful intentions, that does not equate to impact. So just remind yourself of that. It's not really your intentions that matter. Unfortunately, it's not. It's the impact of what you do. So I would just really hope that if you can remember that piece, that's so very important. Intent does not equal impact. So one of the things that we did want to talk about is we wanted to talk about advocacy and anti-racism. And, the R word, racism, a lot of people don't want to say it, but it's real. And so racism is real. So we really need to focus on countering that racism, anti-racism. Now, Giselle, you mentioned something earlier, and I wanted to circle back to it because what you described is the definition of anti-racism. You mentioned giving Black kids the opportunities to speak, giving people the opportunities to explain themselves. Anti-racism is affording the same opportunities to people of color that white people inherently have, knowing that that is deserving, knowing that it is a right, and knowing that it should be there. And unfortunately, that is not always the case. So that is anti-racism. One of the biggest things we can do to separate anti-racism from social justice. I know, a lot of people love social justice, and social justice is so important, and it has its place, and so does multicultural competence and cultural competence and all those things. But one of the things that that lacks is action. So anti-racism is really rooted in action. And so when I think about action, I would just like to encourage you to think about three things. Actions, as it relates to anti-racism and things that you can implement, things that you can do. Think about the people, policies, and the practices. Call them the 3 Ps. So what can you do? How can you communicate with the people who are being impacted? What do you say? How do you show up? And allies are wonderful. But if you are the type of ally who reaches out to someone in private and you say, oh, I saw what happened to you, and I heard what happened to you, and I'm so sorry. That's not the kind of ally I want. It's just not. I need the type of ally who is going to show up for me in the spaces where I'm being discriminated against. I need the type of ally who is going to speak up for me when I am not in the room, because perhaps they have the power and the privilege to be there in my absence. So if you consider yourself to be an ally, you really, really, really need to show up, and you need to show up publicly, not in private. Nobody needs that. That is not the type of advocacy that is helpful. In fact, silence is permission. Silence is agreement. And so we need our allies to speak up. So you think about the people, the policies, and the practices. So what are the policies that are in place that perpetuate systemic oppression? What are the policies in place? I think about, being someone who is rooted in the criminal justice system and have worked in prisons and jails and a former parole probation officer. I think about the men who were on my caseload, who were there for possession of marijuana, where we have people who are now on the stock market investing in CBD, trying to get rich, but nobody's complaining about that. Those are the types of policies that disenfranchise people of color. I think about the difference between crack and cocaine. I think about the opioid addiction right now and how horrible it is. But when all that stuff happened in the 80s and early 90s, people were getting locked up left and right. And now we're looking for Narcan. And now we are trying to figure out how to get people treatment. Why were we not doing that in the 80s? I could talk about it all day, but I will spare you. The last thing are the practices.
Yeah, don't
Thank you. The last thing are the practice.
I gotta get this. I've had this conversation with local politicians for the past several years. Here in Connecticut, all you see when you drive from West Hartford is cannabis, cannabis, cannabis. And when I'm trying to sell uniforms to a couple of dispensaries, all these people from the West Coast are coming out here making tons of money. And just a couple of years ago, they've been locking Black and brown people up, giving them criminal records, and now all of a sudden they come out from San Francisco.
Oh, it looks like we lost Mark again. But you know, what I will say is people, policies, and practices. It's the people, policies, and practices. And so, and you know, so in practice, what are you doing in practice? What are you doing at your jobs? What are you doing in your churches? What are you doing in your neighborhood? Well, how are you treating your neighbors? So those are the three things that I really think are so very important. We had some other things to share, but you know, we really want to be respectful of time and to allow you all the opportunities to engage and to ask your questions. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Ace. Thank you so much, Ace.
Yeah, no problem. And thank you. I mean, I'm very happy that we have this on a Friday so individuals can absorb the materials and information you're giving to us so we can set our egos aside, like what was stated, and really take it in. And I want to direct it back because we do have to. Sonia, I know you wanted to say something, so I'm bringing it back to you if you want to say a statement or question. I didn't want to cut you off.
Thank you, Ace. What I wanted to say is I often see, it's an analogy that I use a lot. It's the ladybug and the spider. I think from my perspective, a lot of African Americans are seen as the spider. We have these two cute little life forms. And when you have the spider, there's more of a tendency to pick up your shoe because you see it as a threat to your life. And with the ladybug, there tends to be more of a tendency to use something in order to pick it up and safely transport it outside. What's happening is collectively, and it's compounding generational trauma, it's compounding trauma. It's not only how we see the world, and when I say we, I'm speaking collectively as people of color, but it's how we perceive the world seeing us. One of the things that Giselle mentioned, it had to do with restorative justice and specifically education. What has to happen from my perspective, police officers cannot be the people that are going to when children are having difficulty. You're talking about you need to have trained professionals, trained mental health professionals. Lots of times, a lot of those behaviors that manifest themselves are from children that have special educational needs. They have behavioral needs as part of their component for education, but they do not have a plan that is indicative to address what it is their needs are in order to be supportive so that they have the services that they need. And what's happening instead is police officers that are called, what's the word that I'm looking for? Police officer, resource officers. From my perspective, they're not being treated as a resource. They're being treated as a criminal component to facilitate that child into the judicial system. And so from my perspective, if you want to talk about restorative justice, we have to restore what our educators are doing. We have to restore what our mental health professionals are allowed to do in spaces. And we have to change how we see the world, and most importantly, how the world sees us. Because as long as you have those two components, the ladybug and the spider, you can understand why one person would pick up the shoe and why somebody else would pick up the tissue and want to safely transport that life outside.
Can I add there just quickly? I know that we're moving toward discussion, but I really appreciate your example there. And what comes to mind when you mention what we have to do is restore our communities, restore our schools, restore these roles. There is some debate about even the language that we use, restorative justice, because what are we restoring to? The quote unquote normal has not been functional ever. Right. So instead, what I think although I can't change the term, right, it's already out there, but I think I'd like to offer a reframe. I think we're creating at this point. We are creating systems. We are creating structures. We're creating new roles that work for our systems and our society as it is in this time and place. We can't think about what was before because it never worked. Right? We are in a new day.
Dr. Hammonds, do you mind giving those other 2 steps? I know we had some people in the chat talk about, I know we talked about community building, but if you would review those other 2. quickly.
Sure, intervention and investment.
Okay.
Yes. So beyond the listening circles and the community building, right? The next step would be intervention. After you've heard what was the wrong, what needs to be fixed or atoned for in some specific way, what then can you do intentionally to atone for that? And then as you begin to figure out what that is and how it can be integrated into the system, investment needs to happen in creating a system that works for the future. You want to give people resources. You want to develop means of allowing that system to flourish and function well past the incident that occurred. And it is important that those things are intentionally done, and it takes time to do that, right? It's not going to be a one shot, okay, we sat down for an hour and now I think I understand and now we're going to go. It takes development and continued listening, and you might even circle back and cycle through steps at times, but it is a process and it takes patience.
So yeah, we definitely want to give space for questions. I'm looking over at the chat just to make sure I catch the Ace. I'm not trying to take your job. I'm sorry. I just wanted to see if anyone had questions or if they had thoughts. And I know we can't see everyone's faces, but we would love to hear from you, even if it's just some reflections or insights that you are kind of leaning with or you're sitting with, right? I do want to borrow. So Dr. Crumb and I attended a Race and Reality webinar series. And one of the things they put out in the front, the presenters put out in the front, was that we will probably leave feeling like this work is undone, right? It won't be a nice bow to put on it. And so to kind of sit with the fact that there may not be closure, probably won't be closure when we leave. We may have more questions than we have answers when we leave. And that's okay, that's part of the work. As a matter of fact, I tell my students that how I know I'm a good educator is that you have more questions when you leave this class than you did when you started. And so that is my hope tonight, that you leave with even more questions and some desires to like seek out more information and seek out more opportunities such as these that you can learn.
I think you
okay.
have a question. Yeah.
I just saw it pop up. So Dr. Cartwright talked about intent not equaling impact. Would you provide an example, Dr. Cartwright, about that?
Sure, I can think of several, but I'll give you one that's personal and that's, related to me. And so I can think of lots of examples that are really rooted in racism, and perhaps it could be people not knowing. I'll share a professional, example. There was once a time where, sounds like I'm about to tell a story, like a fairy tale. There was once upon a time, but there was once upon a time where I was negotiating a salary at a job. And I knew for sure that that the salary that they were offering me at the time, and this was several years ago, was not equitable. And I knew that because one of my friends had just got a job at this place, and he was a white man. And so he was telling me, oh, when you go in, they're going to give you this, you're going to get that, and it's going to be wonderful. Well, they offered me a salary that was $10,000 below his. And I was trying to figure out, like, what's really going on? Because this is what he told me. And so needless to say, I didn't accept the job. But when I did not accept the job, but later I had a conversation with someone who worked there. And they said, well, what really happened with your offer was that we knew you were young, you were about to get married, and you were thinking about starting a family. So with that extra $10,000 would have came more responsibilities. And we didn't want to put that stress or that pressure on you. So we were trying to help you. So the intent there, now I know that it's racism. I know that it's because of my intersections. It could have been because I was Black. It could have been because I was a woman. It could have been because I appeared to be younger than I really am. And I'll take that part as a compliment. But there were so many different things. So they say they intended to help me, but the impact was far greater than that. And so that's just, you know, one example that comes up for me about intent equaling impact. The other thing that comes to mind for me about intent versus impact is there's this video circulating, and it was circulating a couple of weeks ago. And Dr. Crumb mentioned this earlier, like I'm the other one who cannot watch the videos. I just cannot do it. So I still have not watched a lot of the killings that have occurred, that have been recorded. I just can't. But I did see this one video of something that was happening in a community. Like there was a Black boy walking around the neighborhood or something. It was his neighborhood that he lived in. Do you all know what I'm talking about? Has anyone seen this? So he was walking around the neighborhood, and there was like a person, a white male who was a part of the army and the armed forces, and was really trying to force this guy out of the neighborhood. And his intent was to protect his community. His intent was to protect his neighborhood, let him tell it. But the impact was so very pervasive and was so racist. So we can say we have the best of intents, but our impact is really what matters. So his intent was to protect his home, was to protect his block, to protect his neighborhood, to make sure that there were not any thugs walking around on the streets. But the impact was far greater than that. And so I hope that helps to provide some concrete examples as to intent versus impact.
And he was a drill sergeant. He got suspended, and they came to his house.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I also think with intent and impact too, you know, we talked about responding right in the moment when you see something happening. So if you're in a meeting, this is a pet peeve of mine. Do not email me after a meeting saying, I'm so sorry that person said something to you. You might as well save that email. In that moment, use your power and privilege. That is not appropriate to say to Janee in this moment. I can't tell you the number of times where I've gotten emails from white colleagues after the meeting is over. And I'm sitting there in my office, like spinning in my head, ruminating, thinking like, oh my gosh, like exhausted, whatever, saying, I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. No response to that right in the moment. So I think about that with intent and impact too. So your intention was, I'm going to follow up with Janee. I'm going to show some empathy, but the impact was like, you really ain't down for me, because if so, you would have responded in that moment. And it actually makes me feel worse, to be very honest. So that's what came up for me.
And can I just add some things that I want everybody to know, like from my time being with you all, what I've seen too, when it comes to diversity, equity, and work, is that some white people and my white colleagues that are my beloved, some of them I know have my back, but they fear making a mistake. So they're like, well, Lonnie, can you do this for me? And I'm like, why don't you do it? It's not because they don't want to. It's just because the pressure, especially right now, because we're bringing so much attention, it makes them apprehensive to do it. And you all, you're not going to lose your privilege. If you get it wrong, ask your Black friend. We'll let you know. Like, we will let you know, but do not let fear get in the way of your courage and what you want and the change that you want to see. And we're talking about some of our bosses at work, right? Dr. Avent Harris and I, we know that they are our allies and believe in us. But when it comes to them making big decision changes, sometimes it's like, oh, I just don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to put the right word or the wrong word in this, Susan. Is it equality? Is it equity this week? Hey, make it something. Ask us. Let's consult. But do something. We have to continue to move it forward. And if you make a mistake, it's okay. Fix it and let's keep it going, because what we know is that we still need to diversify some of the people who are making these decisions. And inaction does not get us to where we need to be.
I just think about how I go back to that word ego, right? Even in the idea about making mistakes, that we're trying to protect our ego in that. I don't want to come across as not knowing what I'm doing or not knowing what I'm talking about. And you can't have an ego when you're trying to grow, period. Right? And if the work is that important to you, put your ego aside. Be willing to accept feedback. Be willing to be told, hey, you didn't get that right. That's okay.
And it makes me think of Bettina Love. If you have not read her books, they're so powerful. She's an educator, and she talks about, to somebody's point about, she doesn't believe in reforming the system. She believes the system is nullable. You have to tear it all down. But anyway, she talks about co-conspirators. And so one of the examples she gives is when Bree Newsom, I don't know if you all remember, when Bree Newsom climbed the pole in South Carolina to take the Confederate flag down, there was a white man who held the pole at the bottom so that the police would not attack Bree, so that if anything happened, he would literally be there because he knew in his power and privilege that they would not physically harm him. So he put himself in the way. And so that's the example that she uses of co-conspirators. So even to move beyond allyship, right? What does it look like to metaphorically hold that pole for somebody? Particularly when you know your power and privilege protects you in a way that it may not, the others may not have that power and privilege.
And one more thing we like to add when we talk about action, we're all about action. We can learn and we can take and we can become aware, but what are we going to do with all of that, right? And what I tell my students is, when you leave my class, I do not expect you to lead a protest. I do not. I mean, if you do, great, invite me. I'll see it on social media. But what you can do is you can change your sphere of influence. You can change the people you live with. You can stop people from saying very ugly words about people. You can stop saying those ugly things yourself. You can challenge some of your thoughts, some of those things that you've learned. So everybody here can do something to after this conversation. So it's great to be aware. It's great to learn. But what are you going to do with it? You may not need to change the world, but read an article, watch a video, go look up some of the things that we've written. We even have some podcasts on this same very subject matter, and listen to it with your spouse tonight. Think about your sphere of influence that you can absolutely change.
Mm-hmm. And that requires some agency, right? That requires some self-motivation. And one of the conversations that's come up over the past year about racial trauma is that, we are, I don't want to say experts, but, this is the work that we do. But this is also the we live this stuff, right? So we have to experience these things. And so we come both with the kind of book knowledge, but we come with some life experiences. So that means this work gets hard. And so part of people who identify as white, part of your responsibility is to take ownership over some of this work. Google, right? If you have questions about things, there are scholars, there are Black scholars, there are scholars of color who have written extensively on these topics. Purchase those books. Check out those articles, check out some of those podcasts, really taking some agency. One of the things that I love that happened for Dr. Crumb and I is last summer when things were probably the height of the social unrest, our white colleague took it upon herself to say, I'm going to initiate writing our statement. She did the research, she compiled the resources. She was like, because I don't want to make y'all do this right now. No, it wasn't in a place of like, I'm taking over. It was a place of, hey, I can get this thing started. If you all want to add some stuff to it, great. But she took ownership of that, and that meant a lot, right? Also, if you think about when you ask racial or diversity experts to come in to compensate them for their work, it takes years of learning, and it takes research, and it takes work. This is laborious in a lot of ways. And so really being mindful to compensate those people who come into your spaces to lend themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and we've shared some of those resources in the chat too for those of you. Podcasts, some little articles. I don't know if y'all want to read like our scholarly articles, but you can Google scholars. But those tend to be a little bit lengthier, a little bit more jargon. But definitely those podcasts are really cool to check out.
Mm-hmm. The one thing I think about is also hunting for, I think I'll use that language intentionally, hunting for and seeking out examples of remnants of white supremacy in the systems that you function in. An example that I think about within my sphere in education is we've been trying to get rid of the GRE as a requirement for our program, for entry into our program, right? We all know there's tons of literature out there about how the GRE is not an adequate judge of a candidate's ability and their potential for success in graduate school. So why are we using it, right? That's one example that we are intentionally trying to move toward. Or I'll share an exciting thing from my program. Due to the pandemic, we've all been doing a lot more Zoom connecting, and typically we would do our open house and our interviews both face-to-face. But when you think about that, what the structure of that creates, it privileges people who have the resources to pay to travel to an interview where we are inviting 50 students to compete for 20 slots. So more likely than not, you will not gain entry into the program, but we're asking you to shell out money for flights, for driving, getting from the airport to where our university is located. It's about 2 hours from the airport, and then a hotel to stay overnight for the interview. That is a lot of money. And so what we did this year for our recent interviews, so we said, we're going to do it all online. And guess what the result of that was? We had the highest applications rates for people of color that our program has ever seen. So it's not that our program is not that there aren't candidates who are able, who are ready, who are willing and excited about this work. It's not that. It's that we were intentionally, maybe unknowingly, creating barriers to entry. So think about things like that, and how can you intentionally remove those barriers?
So I know.
I just put it in the chat that Dr. Hammonds, that's a wonderful example of the 3 Ps, the policy piece.
Yeah.
So when we think about people, policies, and practices, changing your admission policies increased your diverse candidates. And so thank you for sharing that wonderful example.
And the diversification of advanced education, as far as these will be our leaders in our school, they need to be diverse, right? Like that's that systemic piece that we have to start looking at.
And I definitely want to say, I know that we want to make sure that we respect everyone's time, and we're getting to the end there, but you all are definitely experts. I want to give you that credit. Don't take that credit away from yourselves. And again, with everything that's happening in the chat, I want to thank you. It's been an honor. I want to stay behind. You don't need to apologize for that. You are empowering doctors, empowering women of color, and those voices need to be brought and echoed. And I greatly appreciate being a part of this and being a individual to have the honor to listen to you and really now be able to take this weekend and digest that, and to really take that in and understand the materials that we may be ignorant to, that we may not even acknowledge in general. And again, this is being recorded so that individuals can look back on this and definitely take the materials that the speakers are just, I love the resources just in this chat, constant podcast resources. And is there any things that the 4 of you would like to, before closing out, really just kind of like the last things you want to just inundate into our minds?
Well, I've already shared my last things, but I will say this. Thank you to all of the sponsors. I've seen the sponsor list from Allie, and because of you, you are taking this word to everyone. I heard a dentist's office. I don't know, but there were some local people in your community who are you all are service providers. These things happen out of education. These things are happening in the community. So thank you to the sponsors. As a speaker for this event, that was so impressive to me. So that creates that community. So thank you for all of the sponsors of this event.
Yes, I echo that. Thank you all for having us, and thank you to all the sponsors.
Yes, thank you so much. We really, really enjoyed being here.
Absolutely. Thank you. The last thing that I'll say is just a reminder about how you can be empowered to change your sphere of influence, right? You don't have to keep going and stay with what is quote unquote normal. You have the power.
Thank you.
Definitely.
Thank you.
Yeah, so definitely volume 2 listening session. I thank all of you for speaking and providing your personal experiences, the resources and knowledge that you have to all of us. And especially one thing that you said that I think that we all can take with us is sitting in heaviness with the resources we got, but not to get to hopelessness, and to really take that material that we have, that you abundantly experts, all four, and take it and sit with it and learn from it. So again, thank you for everyone who is joining us for this excellent volume 2. And again, resources in the chat. Again, for our sponsors, we have our Ellington Dental Group, CD Builders, People's United of Ellington, and Toria de Lapre. They assisted in making this happen, and I again thank the 4 wonderful doctors to just enlighten us. Have a great night, everybody, and a great weekend.
Beautiful. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure.